All right, everyone. Welcome to Philosophy for the People. Welcome back. We're gonna go after some low hanging fruit today. I
Yeah.
guess we're fashionably late or unfashionably, uh, because we're gonna comment on this whole Jordan Peterson thing.
Well, it's not
And
really fair when one of these big videos comes out right before we both go on vacation for a week, and then we don't get a chance to create an episode and record.
that's
That wasn't thoughtful
that's
of.
all right. I'm not known for my timeliness, anyways. But yeah. So for people who aren't familiar, Jordan Peterson went on this program, which is it's very interesting, right? It's called Surrounded, right? I honestly, cards on the table. I have not watched the full thing. I've seen clips here, and there online, but it's like one guy versus 20 other guys and gals, right? And there's always different representatives from different positions. And in this case, it was super controversial because it was one Christian versus 20 atheists. And one wonders why they chose
Well,
Jordan Peterson
I was
as
yeah.
as the
I was gonna say
representative here, which
you
I'm
put
sure
a
we'll get into all that. So that caused a whole bunch of commotion. But right, we figured everyone else is talking about this. Why be original? So why don't we just talk about it too? And like I said, I haven't seen this, so a lot of this is whatever you throw out, Mike, will be pretty new to me. So you're going to
well,
get my raw thoughts on a lot
Well,
of
and
this
we
stuff.
can, I mean, and some of it, like, not that I want it to be totally based off vibes or whatever, but some of it we can sort of just, what was the tone of the argument or the nature of the discussion, which I think is worth talking about, especially when you're writing about or thinking about philosophy and philosophical discourse, that always has to kind of come into play. But what I really wanted this to be about, because um there's already enough of a not it has a negative connotation, but like cult of personality around Jordan Peterson, whether it's positive or negative.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't want this to really be so focused on that. I wanted to be more focused on the claims, because the claims themselves, obviously, when we're trying to have, I mean, this is philosophy for the people. And so we want to investigate the claims themselves. And so that's what I wanted this most to be about. And even though, yeah, obviously it makes sense to have watched the video, or to watch it very closely and take copious notes, you could have not watched this at all, Pat, and you could still investigate these claims and say, are they valid, are they worth discussing, like you can still have responses. Does that make sense too? So that's kind
Yeah,
of what I
well, we're trusting Mike here. He's gonna. We're not gonna play clips because I don't feel like going through all that tediousness. So Mike just
was.
has some things here that he'll explain the situation. He'll explain the claims, quote them, and if we're missing any important context, people will surely let us know in the comments, which I almost never read anyway. So thank you.
Well,
Yeah.
and some of these too, like, I mean, if you are familiar with any of Peterson's, whether it's past YouTube videos or read any of his books or whatever, like some of these would not really surprise you that these are kind of the claims that are being made in this kind of surrounded video.
Mhm.
But there were four kind of big ones that if you were to watch it, it kind of breaks it up into almost like four chapters. And the
Okay.
first one is atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting.
And
Okay.
that's Peterson's claim, to be clear.
That's like, yeah. So then obviously,
So the context is he makes his claim, and then he has to argue against whoever they throw up at
yeah,
him, right? From this
yeah,
pool of people. Got it. Yep.
yeah. So and so, like I was saying, like we can look at the claim itself. It's not even so much that we're arguing against Peterson. It's almost like, well, is the claim itself coherent, and is there some truth to it, or what distinctions can we make? So that's
Yeah.
kind of what I want to do. Like I said, with this first one, I'll just say it one more time just to kind of repeat it and get in people's brains. But like, atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting.
Yeah, false. I mean, that's just false. I mean,
I
it's just
mean,
like, I mean, some do. I mean, like, yeah, surely some reject a very cartoonish understanding of God.
mhm,
Um, so I mean, it depends, like how wide he intends this claim to be. If he means that this is without any exception, it's just clearly false. I mean, there's just
mhm,
lots of very sophisticated atheists, professional philosophers who have a lot of conceptual clarity about what they're rejecting, and it's a clarity about what God is, how we understand God, through even just a definite description that the theist would agree with, right? Like I can
mhm.
think of atheists off the top of my head where they say, I reject this. And what they state is, I have no issue with the statement. I'll say, yeah, no, that's what I accept. now
Yeah.
we disagree about its ontological status, but there's no disagreement about their understanding what they're rejecting. So the first one is just wrong if it's meant to be universal. The only way that that could be true is if he weakens it to say that there's just a lot of atheists who reject God without having a right or proper understanding of God. That's fine, but it's almost trivial. There's a lot of people who reject all sorts of things that just reject a cartoon version of it. So, I mean,
Well,
that's just right.
and this is one of the things that you'll sometimes find. Sorry, I moved my camera a little. This is one of the things that you'll sometimes find is like it's almost like you say this really attention grabbing, like almost clickbaity sort of take, but then when it actually gets investigated, you're like, oh well, that's not, I'm not as extreme as it maybe sounds. And
Walking back,
then it
Mott
gets
and
walked
Bailey type
back
of stuff. Yeah.
so much to the point where it's like, well, who could disagree with it at that
Yeah.
point?
It's
It's
just,
like,
becomes uninteresting.
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think, obviously, and when you're doing these, YouTube videos or whatever, you have to be kind of clickbaity and attention grabbing. And it would be interesting for somebody to kind of break down and he would be the first to say too, like he's not a, professional philosopher or whatever, but it would be interesting for somebody to break down and really make the distinctions of like, okay, we can go through a person's like you were even saying, like in your experience, you've said like, yeah, a person who claims to be an atheist will say, give a definition that even I would agree with, and then they would disagree with it. So it's like you can't really say it's a question of understanding. But then there has to be, like, if you kind of break it down further, where is that even more fundamental disagreement? And obviously, when you kind of go through this and when you have these conversations or read these articles or whatever, you go through a lot of the objections. And of course, many of them can be kind of boiled down to the classic two that Aquinas gives, right? When either God is superfluous or the problem of evil, basically.
Or God is refuted. Right. Yeah.
And obviously, like both of those, like the reason why those are valid objections, a Christian could look at and say, well, you're misunderstanding. You don't understand this aspect of God or this aspect of the nature of God, which actually answers them, right? I mean, I think even, and so obviously you could argue then, well, that even deeper level, there's a quote misunderstanding or they don't understand, right? But on the surface, yeah, it's a, and again, it's a very sweeping kind of,
Yeah, and again, I just don't want to say that as any sort of universal claim, because I think it's just obviously demonstrably false. I think atheists are mistaken at some level, but the nature of that mistake is not so quick and easy as just saying you don't understand what you're talking about. I will say that I think for a lot of people who are skeptical, including my former self, and I've said this before, they need some conceptual help with God. And I've said this before, lots of times, the sort of the God that I rejected for many, many years is still a God to reject now. Right. So I needed some conceptual space opened up to me, ways of thinking about God that I had not previously considered that made theism a much more attractive and viable option. That's true. That I think that's the case for a lot of people. But to say across the board, the only reason somebody is an atheist is because they have no idea what they're rejecting is just silly. It's just not true. So false.
And I feel like I'm going to get the name wrong. I think you brought him up before too, but wasn't it Friedrich Coppelstein, the one who in the debate kind of made a similar sort of thing where it's like he was debating somebody about atheism and the atheist put forward this idea of God. And he said, well, I agree with you if that's, what you mean by God, basically. And I think, you've already said it. I'm not going to rehash it. So I don't know. Is there any,
so the basic claim there, I like I said, I haven't watched the thing, so I'd be curious to hear how Peterson tries to back it up, but I cannot imagine a way that claim could be backed up unless somebody significantly weakens it or walks back from what it seems to be on its face.
Yeah. And I mean, there was a little bit, so, I don't think every person got named. So when I was putting my outline together, I just put like first person, second person, third person. And so like you got a little bit of this, some people almost like walked into the idea a little bit because one person kind of put forward like the one less God than you, like, oh well, I'm an atheist to all these, you're an atheist to all these other gods, I just happen to be an atheist to that one as well. And so that obviously like does misunderstand what at least Christians and classical theists mean by God. And so that person did sort of like, I guess they kind of took the bait a little bit, because what it did show that they saw, the classical theist God or the Christian view of God as just another, little g God is sometimes how they're described too. So there was a little bit of that element as well.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I saw a clip on this point. Is this where the atheist representative said to Peterson that he rejects all sorts of things, including other deities, without knowing anything about them? Right. That's that. So is it the context of this? If not, then I'll just generalize it.
No,
Yeah.
and I'll be honest, it came up a couple of times because like sometimes, like oftentimes, people sometimes came up to it and they already had like their pre-written like statement. Like
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
was
People
one of the
prepare.
things that kind of bothered me about it in general, is that it was a lot of grandstanding.
Well, for sure. If you only got like however much time, I don't know how much time they have, they're going to come in and try and be as provocative and assertive as possible, I
and
guess.
because and none of them are like, none of them do this for a living, so it's almost like they had the thing that they had thought about so much, that was the thing they were ready to say. They weren't really ready to like answer questions on the fly, because this wasn't something that, they hadn't written a whole book about this, Pat.
Okay. So yeah. Well, okay. Well, let's take that, right. So the idea, the previous thing I said, because I know I saw
Yeah.
a clip on this, and the claim was essentially trying to throw it back in Peterson's face, is that you reject a whole bunch of stuff that you don't know anything about, and then just throw out some sort of mythological deity, and presumably Peterson would say he doesn't know a lot about it.
Yeah.
And what should one say about that sort of thing? Well, I think one should say that you don't necessarily reject it, right? You're just sort of agnostic about it. You don't really have much of an opinion about it one way or another. And to the extent that maybe you come into a more informative sort of description about it, then you might have reason to reject it. I mean, take like Santa Claus. The reason I reject Santa Claus is not just because I don't think that there's a whole lot of evidence for Santa Claus. I think there's a lot of evidence against Santa Claus, right? The things that I would expect to see if Santa Claus were real, in like the very cartoonish kiddie version of it, are just not really the things that show up on the scene, as it were, right? And all the things that I would expect if Santa Claus were just this sort of cultural fiction, those are the sorts of things that actually appear in front of me. So I have good reason to reject Santa Claus. I don't have, at least once he's appropriately sort of described to me. So I'm not even agnostic about him, but other things that I just really don't know a whole lot about, I would just become increasingly agnostic. So I don't necessarily reject them in the sense that an atheist rejects God, and that just comes down to, again, how one classifies oneself. I just follow the traditional classifications. A theist is somebody who says yes to the question, does God exist? An atheist says no. An agnostic is somebody who says, I don't know. So it's true. I'm agnostic about all sorts of things that I don't know about. I recently put up a post about agnosticism. I was on a trip to Michigan, as you know, Mike, and I was agnostic about the types of fish that lived in the Great Lakes. And until I ate one of them, right? And then I wasn't agnostic anymore, right?
So you had that noetic knowledge, I think is what they call that. Yeah.
Then and it was described to me. So, but I mean, obviously, I would say that the God of Christianity, the God of classical theism, once it is appropriately described to me what we mean by God, I think there's all sorts of good reasons to believe in God, all sorts of good evidence, if you like, that is not equally evidence for the lowercase g type of entities, the Thors or the Zeuses or anything like that. And, it's a whole conversation to have there, but at least that's the general direction I think one should go on those sorts of remarks. Yeah.
Well, and to circle back to the original claim, I think your example of like the Santa Claus thing sort of illustrated it well, because your belief, or to use the phrase lack of belief, it implies a knowledge of the essence, right? When you say like, when I know this thing, what everybody agrees to be, or what everybody calls Santa Claus, and what all that would entail, or what all that includes, that's what allows for you to say, this is the evidence for it, and this is the evidence against it, or this is the lack of evidence for it and the evidence against it. And that, again, it goes back to the understanding or / misunderstanding thing.
Yeah, I just want to be careful and qualify. It's not a knowledge of the essence always necessarily, because we don't have a knowledge of God's essence. What we have is a definite description, right? But that's just a sort of pedantic point, so I'll let it go, right?
Sure.
hmm
So yeah, I don't know. I think that's probably good enough for claim one if we want to.
Good enough for claim, and I don't even know
Yeah.
if the clip that I saw was relevant to that section, but you get what you get here.
It's
So,
in there some way.
yeah.
And you know, again, a lot of these things sort of like cycle, or they recycle themselves in different ways. So because I kind of said that later on in the outline too. I was like, I feel like I've heard this before, but anyway, claim two. So claim two, he says morality and purpose can't be found within science. So morality and purpose can't be found within science.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm gonna say that that's true, but almost trivial, as in I don't know like a whole lot of people that disagree with that, even naturalists, right? So
Yeah.
like this isn't necessarily an attack on
Well-
atheism. I know many naturalists that are moral realists, even if they're moral non-naturalists. I think there's a little bit of a tension there, but let it go. Who would say that, yeah, this is not, we don't sort of come at morality through the hypothetico-deductive method, through the scientific method. So I think it's true. I just don't think it's entirely interesting, and it certainly isn't like this huge attack on atheism that he might think that it is. I would need to hear how he states it, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, and again, it chalk it up to another one of these, like, well, how is it used in the popular culture, and is that what's really being like undermined or kind of being subverted or whatever? Is it the idea of like, well, you know, morality is all subjective or morality is all relative, and that's what this is supposed to kind of like be, you know, undermining, because the opposite assumption is that the only things that aren't relative or the only things that aren't subjective are what are found in science. And so that's what this is sort of trying to kind of play around with. That's kind of, again, that's just kind of a question I have. Obviously they don't like, he doesn't go through his whole background into making that claim or bringing that up.
Yeah, well, let me just play around with some ideas here, and these may or may not be relevant to the conversation. So I assume that he's assuming that most people want to be moral realists. They think that whatever else morality is, when we make certain moral claims that are represented by presumably true moral propositions, such as murder is wrong and should never be done or whatever.
Yeah.
That these aren't just sort of statements of opinions or sentiments or fancies or what have you. They're independent of our opinions or sentiments, right? And there's something that can help set that objectivity, right? We might call it. Does science set it? Well, no, of course not. Science might give us relevant details, relevant empirical details that are important to moral considerations, but science is not the way to go about adjudicating disputes between moral realists and moral anti-realists. Where this argument might be interesting is if somebody is like a committed, hardcore, hardball physicalist or reductionist, and they think that everything needs to be explained, essentially through atomic and evolutionary theory, then yeah, I think you probably come out of that as an anti-realist. It's hard to see how a moral realism fits with that view without being extremely contrived. In which case somebody can kind of maybe have to choose between what they feel their stronger commitments are, a sort of a reductive picture like that, or a moral realist picture, and then they would have to try to revise accordingly by presumably giving one of those up, right? But again, to be fair, not all atheists, not all naturalists are, hardball physicalists. They could be more like theists. Theists will say, hey, science is really powerful. It can tell us a lot about the world. It can even give us relevant details that factor into our moral reasoning. But to adjudicate these wider disputes is going beyond the boundaries of science, properly understood. There's naturalists who could say that for sure. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think like and again, this is totally like speculating or extrapolating off of what you actually watch or what you can actually what you actually see in the video. But you sometimes think like, is it this hope of trying to almost like resurrect a teleology? Because when you talk about morality and purpose, well, you think of, okay, my purpose is this thing out in front of me, right? Something ahead of me, some goal or some end. And so obviously we're using teleological language. And same thing when it comes to, the natural law tradition, is it relies on this idea of things are made for something else, or there is this inherent purpose or this inherent telos within the created order. And so obviously that's where so much of and like I said, not just Catholic morality, but natural law morality kind of comes from is that it's built in, and that obviously we recognize that from observation, we recognize that from quote unquote science. Now I realize since like the Enlightenment that so much of there's been a huge rejection or a lot of rejection of this idea of telos or things being built into nature, to the created order. And so maybe that's what this claim or this idea is trying to kind of like I guess redeem or resurrect. Does that make sense?
Maybe, yeah. So,
And I think that's
we know,
worthwhile.
yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
I
So
mean, it's
I mean, I agree. I think that our world is one with essences and names, right? With
mm,
natures that have inbuilt teleological arrows. Um, and I would argue that, yeah, that actually helps to make sense of a lot of the success of science, including why we're able to um, engage in universal generalizations and get laws of nature as the laws of the natures of things. But I would also argue that that's something that again is not that science gives us. It helps to uh, undergird science, a lot of it
mm.
conceptually, and it seems to be
Sorry, it's kind of a
darn
chicken and egg thing, right?
yeah. Well,
Mm,
it seems to be darn difficult to eliminate entirely. I mean, we know that it's been sort of a project to just get teleology out of the picture, but it keeps
mm.
popping back up again and again and again. And I think that's right. I don't think you can coherently try
One
and
might even call it Aristotle's revenge.
yeah. I mean,
one,
there's lots of
one
good. I
could.
mean, this is a huge debate, right? There's tons of literature on it. So I'm just kind of showing where I fall in that debate. But surely all these debates go beyond the boundaries of science as typically understood. Of course, once again, one could just try to conceptually expand the boundaries of science, but then you're just going to expand it to include pretty much all these various aspects of philosophy to the point that it becomes a sort of uninteresting statement of what science actually is. Yeah.
Well, then, yeah. So, and obviously, I mean, when the term science is being used in this context, it's referring to the physical sciences, not the, kind of medieval or scholastic sense of science just being, any source of knowledge. So, you wouldn't call theology a science in this context. You're only talking about whatever physics, chemistry, biology, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So,
hmm
because yeah, as you were saying, if you want to expand science to mean any realm of knowledge, then obviously you're talking, philosophy, natural theology, and then
Yeah. And then you're
it
going to
becomes
open it up for arguments for God and
then
teleology
I'm
and all
right on
that.
board.
Yeah.
Then I'm like, oh yeah, of
We're all
course, right?
scientists
Yeah,
now, friend, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's yeah, uh,
I'm something of a scientist myself.
exactly. So, but anyway, so it. I think what it's, because again, it's sort of trying to play around with the whole like faith versus science false dilemma, and kind of in some way, and I think it's a useful endeavor to kind of bring some of these assumptions to the forefront, because if somebody thinks that the only method of finding the truth is what you see in like the scientific method and experiments and things like that, then you're cutting yourself off from this huge source of quote unquote science or quote or of knowledge that is going to, again, he didn't just include morality in this, he talked about purpose. And so this is a huge thing for humans when it comes to making meaning, which again, if you're familiar with Peterson's other work in general, in psychology, but then also in sort of like the 12 rules and all that stuff, it's all about helping people like find and understand meaning that is beyond the physical kind of material world that you can see in front of you. And so again, it makes sense, it's on brand for this kind of claim, but kind of like what you said, in some sense, it can become almost explained away to the point where it becomes, uninteresting, or you're not really saying anything anymore, which, I think sometimes people have made that complaint about Peterson, and some of the stuff that he's
Yeah,
saying.
I mean, there are admirable qualities of Peterson. I'm not a huge follower, and I've barely read any of his stuff, but I I find sympathy with the complaints. He's just, you know, willfully obtuse at times, deliberately and unhelpfully evasive. All that stuff I find very annoying.
And that's honestly, that's probably
Yeah.
one of the biggest takeaways that people have had from this particular surrounded video, which,
Mhm.
as you said, that's been par for the course for basically the last whatever 5 years or so. Is, he came onto the scene and he was this huge thing, and then people really started to ask like the deeper questions, which makes sense, right? You're initially taken in by somebody who speaks really well, somebody is very erudite or whatever, and then you say, look, okay, but I want to go deeper, I want to go further, and it's almost like it's been a tough a tough nut to crack, sort of.
Yeah, there's a term for it, the IYI, the intellectual yet idiot, and then people probably get upset about that, but these sort of the eloquent manner of speaking that just lacks any sort of necessary precision and conceptual clarity is just not impressive to me at all. A lot of it just strikes me as sophistry. Again, I admire certain qualities about it, but I find that whole aspect just very, very frustrating. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's actually, so again, as I was
why I don't follow him, right? Because I just never found that it's worth following to begin with. Yeah. Well, except for where he talks like, just the good old like practical life advice, the concrete, like a lot of that's fine, great, perennial wisdom. What do you talk about? Like, clean your room and stuff like that.
Stand up straight, yeah,
like good, fine there, no issues there, right? But once he gets off into these other realms, man, I'm
waiting for that 13th rule that says smile more. That's the next one I'm looking forward to.
Something like that.
Yeah. This is actually, so again, as I was kind of making my outline, this is where the person says straight up, like, are you a Christian? And it's actually later on, which this is another indication that, like, I don't think the people were listening as much. They were just kind of waiting for their own turn to talk. But somebody else later on assumes that he is, when it's like, well, the person earlier already asked and he didn't answer it. So it's kind of like, okay, are you, but again, it's
sort of ridiculous. I mean, were they told that they were debating a Christian, or were they just told that they were debating Jordan Peterson? I have no idea. The title of the video was "One Christian versus 20 Atheists," which I just think is just extremely misleading. But yeah, I'll let it go.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it, and this is actually one of the other notes that I put in is there's so many ambiguous terms throughout the entire thing, but in a sense, Christian has become such an ambiguous term too, and it's not even and I mean that we could make a whole episode about that, but that there was a lot of ambiguity, and the fact that, like you've kind of pointed out, it's almost like people have adopted the term Christian to mean whatever is convenient for it to mean in whatever context. So it's going to get more clicks if it says, you're not going to say classical theist. Nobody's going to know what that means.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
You're going to say, you're just going to say Christian. You're like, oh, well, that's close enough, or that includes it. And it's like, well, that's not, Socrates would wag his finger at you if he heard that. So, well, he'd probably ask, what is a Christian? That's what Socrates would do.
Right,
but anyway, let's see. There's this is also where we get the Euthyphro, the false dilemma kind of what came first, is something good because God said so, or did God say so because it's good? So we get a little bit of that in here. I don't know if we want to talk about that more, but one of the people
I've talked about it a lot. I'd be curious how Peterson himself dealt with that, but I'm not privy to that clip, so I can't say. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, I guess I can't, I don't have the whole response written down off the top of my head. It was one of those where I was like, oh, it's kind of cool that I guess it came up. It was kind of an inversion of it. So it's like, it's almost like, where does it come from us, or does it come from God? And that's kind of what the Euthyphro dilemma was too, right? Because it was sort of this, it's almost like a cynical question of like, well, does it actually exist, or is it just something that we've all kind of it only exists because we believe that it does?
Not quite. So the original Euthyphro, going back to Plato, there's this pagan priest in this dialogue, Euthyphro, and they're talking about piety, right? And we can just translate it because it's originally in with respect to polytheism, right? But it's do the gods will something because it's good, or something good because the gods will it? But just translate it to, or pious or what have you, but just translate it as it has been against classical theism, right? Does God will something because it is good, or is something good because God wills it? And the idea here is to present the theist with two quite unattractive options, right? So, on the one hand, if God wills something because it's good, it seems like God himself is under some standard that is higher than himself. And for a theist, that's kind of against your core commitment that God is the absolute, right? The end all be all. On the other hand, it would make it seem like morality is totally arbitrary, that there's no constraint upon morality, and that certain moral facts that seem necessary, such as the wrongness of rape or whatever, could have been different had God willed differently, right? A sort of extreme voluntarism. Now, I think that that's actually a very powerful argument against certain forms of theism, mainly non-classical forms of theism. But as I've said before, and I've written in lots of places, in fact, I have a more technical paper on this under review right now, I think classical theism avoids this issue because it identifies God with the good. It has a certain conception of goodness as primitive and fundamental. So the classical theist has resources to go between the horns here, right? In a very sort of Platonic and Neoplatonic fashion. And there are interpretations and understandings of original Euthyphro that it wasn't at all intended as some argument against God, but actually an argument that was supposed to gesture towards a monotheism in particular. It's a minority interpretation, but I think it's plausible. But that's what it is, and I think that's a generally better direction to begin thinking about it. I don't know what this version is that was offered in the video because I haven't seen it, and I certainly don't know Peterson's responses. But now you made me curious. I'll probably have to go watch it afterwards, and I'll be like, "Oh, missed opportunity."
Yeah, I didn't include the timestamp, and like I said, it wasn't exactly the same thing. It was kind of the inversion of it, and maybe I was misspoken about it. But anyway, yeah, it's a good, I think, like you said, it, if anything, it becomes this really strong argument for the classical understanding of God, which obviously from both of our standpoints, this is like good. It's helping you kind of see through and say, well, you recognize this as a false dichotomy, and then say, but what's the way through it? Which,
Yeah, well, I mean, it presents like all good arguments. Good arguments present tensions that need to be resolved. So the question is, well, how are you going to resolve this tension? I think one way you can resolve it and slip between the horns is to move towards a traditional. It's not just divine simplicity, but the whole metaphysical program that comes with it. It's understanding of goodness and the transcendentals and all that. You need all those resources, I think, right? Or you just give up divine sovereignty and aseity, or you attenuate them and you take some sort of Platonism, right? And God plays some role in morality, but he's no longer the absolute. I mean, there are theists that take that option too, and then they can take one horn at a dilemma and say, God will things because they're good and they're constrained by this Platonic theory or whatever, and blah blah blah. They essentially relegate God to a form of a demiurge or whatever. But that's what I mean. And there's other theists that take the other horn, right? They do take a sort of strong voluntarism as well. So there are options. I just think some are a lot less attractive than others. Yeah.
Well, and it almost becomes then it's like not a God that you want to believe in anyway, which I guess it shouldn't really come down to what you want, but it's sort of, it definitely becomes a much less attractive, quote unquote version of God. If that's what you have to kind of, resign yourself to. But
yeah, no. So it's a good dilemma. Good is in I don't think it's ultimately successful, but it's useful. It makes you think, and hopefully think hard about deep and important matters. Right. And it raises tensions, which is good. And it's good to have tensions because they can often lead to much fruit and understanding.
So there's a couple of times, and I bring it up here with the seventh person, but the person doesn't bring it up, but in Peterson's response, he brings up Cardinal Newman and talking about conscience a little bit. And yeah, and I've heard this before. It's not something that I've spent a ton of time studying. I've heard people talk about John Henry Newman uses the conscience as an argument for God. Are you familiar with that, or have you?
He does. He's got an argument from conscience. I'm certainly not specialized in it. I read not too long ago, I think, an article in American Catholic on it, and I found it intriguing and and worth further investigation, which I never followed up upon because, as always, I have a million other things I have to do first. So, yeah, no, this is in Newman's thought. He does have an argument from conscience. It's true. Yeah,
which I think is fine, because I think it has a lot of it might have a lot of persuasive value, because most people would recognize in themselves this sense of conscience, and so it's a good. I think it points you towards Aquinas's fourth way, to be honest. So like when we're talking about the standard of being, and people will talk about, like, even if we disagree on this thing being right or wrong, we both have a sense of there is ultimate right, or ultimate wrong. And so that's kind of what conscience is sort of pushing you towards. And so to that degree, I think it sort of falls under that category, which I know I've kind of made this joke before, but I lump every argument for God under one of Aquinas's 5 ways, which I think he was kind of like, that's why he gives you those 5, is that they're simplified versions. And then we can sort of create these, more, like more specific, like things that relate to more specific areas of life. So like when Newman kind of has this, like I said, argument from conscience, which I think Peterson confuses a little bit here. He calls God conscience or something. It was kind of weird the way that he said it.
I mean that's ridiculous, right? I mean, Newman would say conscience is a messenger.
Yeah.
But
which, if he's alluding to this idea of,
but hold on, pause, because that's like
yeah.
deeply ironic, right? So Peterson accuses the atheists of not understanding God, but then Peterson calls God conscience. I mean, this is just, I mean, that's like it's a flagrant misunderstanding of what Christians understand God to be, right? I mean, it's
well, yeah, because I mean, obviously, then it becomes then you kind of become God in a sense, right? Because if that's the thing telling you what's right and wrong. But like I said, I want to.
I'll give him credit. Maybe
yeah, I want to be a little bit,
God
like,
is reflected in conscience. Maybe he meant something more subtle. But if he's just defining God as conscience, that's a misstep for sure.
Well, and it would I mean, it's not entirely materialist, but then obviously like it's leaning more towards the, like, we kind of create God instead of God creating us too, a little bit. But
it could be interpreted in all number of ways, but I think that's a very poor way to start trying to help people with a Christian understanding of God, right?
And like I said, a lot of these, like, and when we were going over our favorite arguments for God, it was sort of one of those where it's like, well, what's the most useful in the moment? And I think, when you're talking to somebody who maybe they do prize their own conscience because they, just are a person with a lot of integrity, and they feel like they follow their conscience even when it's really difficult. And so that might be a good avenue to kind of point them towards this idea of, a standard of morality or a standard of goodness or being, which Christians people understand to be God. And so,
yeah, I mean, Newman has the famous, conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ. It's an internal witness to the divine law and all that sort of stuff, right? And he's got, I mean, Newman's super interesting. I love Newman's thought in many areas. But I don't know if I would be enthusiastic to have like Peterson be the primary representative of that.
But just in the interest of time, why don't we jump to claim 3?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Let's just hit a few more here. This is.
Oh, we only got 2 left. So, I mean,
okay, cool,
we should be fine. But the third claim is everybody worships something, including atheists, even though they, even though they might not know it. So everybody worships something, including atheists, even though they might not know it.
I mean, that's going to heavily depend upon what one means by worship, right? If we mean some sort of ritualistic sacrifice, I think the answer is no, right?
You say you didn't watch this, but it's almost like you're guessing beat for beat what's going to happen.
I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? Yeah, I mean, like, just obvious, we mean like some form of ritualistic worship, as in which for Catholics, worship is sacrifice, right? Especially the representation, right, of Christ on the cross, and the Eucharist, right, is being offered to God.
Well, the first question that comes up when the person,
and in that sense, no, atheists do not. They clearly do not worship something, right? In that sense,
it's another example of kind of the, you make the very audacious claim, and then it becomes whittled down to something that it's almost like, well, who can disagree with this?
Yeah, they'll say, well, you just care about something.
Well, so they do kind of force him in. They get him to define it, and he says, attend to, prioritize, and sacrifice for. And obviously there's nothing like inherently wrong about those descriptions
Yeah, but
in
it's
terms
not
of
a
defining it.
traditional understanding of worship. I mean, he
And
has sacrifice there, but sacrifice for. So I mean, like a personal sacrifice, and even there, I don't know. I mean, there's some people who don't really want to I mean, maybe no. I just don't even think that. I mean, yes, everybody has priorities. That's just absolutely trivial, right?
mm,
Everyone has some sort of highest or higher concerns than others. That's absolutely trivial. And in a lot of cases, people are willing to sacrifice for those higher concerns. But no, sometimes people are just like super
well,
selfish, right?
so
And they
kind of
just they
the gotcha that the guy tried to use was like, well, do you attend to your wife? Do you prioritize your wife? Do you sacrifice for your wife? And any good husband would say, oh, of course, right? But then we become uncomfortable when somebody uses, oh, so you worship your wife?
yeah, it's a
Now,
great that is a great counter example. So yeah.
and what it says to me, because again, if just the English use of the word worship has changed from, going back to like Shakespeare's time or whatever. So it's like it is one of those things that I think we have this kind of built in because we're built on kind of a Protestant kind of mindset of rejecting, especially when it comes to worship of this quote unquote worship of the saints, quote unquote worship of Mary, things like that, which that language was used in older kind of English
Yeah, it
Catholic
was,
like
right, yeah,
documents or whatever.
yeah.
And so yeah, you say, oh, do you worship your wife to a man in the 1500s England, and he would probably have less of an issue with it because
But they
the
would
word
understand it
worship.
more along the lines
Yeah,
of a veneration and stuff like
yeah.
that, right? Yeah, so
And
these
so
distinctions were made for various purposes, some polemical purposes, but
so
yes,
it highlights that
mhm,
ambiguity, which I mean, that's probably the biggest takeaway that I had. There were only two people for this claim, that that they spent some time on, but
mhm.
and the other guy actually, and this is the one guy that I think Peterson was like, I'm done with him, get him out of here. Which I mean, he had a little bit of a
There's
an
a little bit
attitude
of
at him,
heat there, yeah, a
but
little bit.
but he actually uses it in regards to the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Mhm,
And again, it was one of those things where it's like, well, Peterson's like, well, I'm not Catholic anyway, but he kind of said that in the video where it's like it shouldn't have been an issue, but it became more of an issue, and that wasn't the thing that got the guy like rejected by Peterson. It was, I mean, it was came up very confrontational, very much with an attitude. Which,
mhm,
I mean, on the flip side though, uh, Peterson did come off as a little defensive throughout, which I don't know how you couldn't be. Like, it would probably be hard for me when it's called surrounded for a reason and everybody's coming at you.
mhm.
But anyway, this one, I don't know if it ruffled feathers a little bit more, if it pricked something, that we can't see, something in his mind, or something, that we're not privy to. But anyway, this is, again, it's one of those ones where it's like, I think it highlighted more than anything that we're just uncomfortable with the term worship. And so we either explain it away where it gets watered down to nothing, or we treat it as this, this is on the flip side, it becomes this like horrible idolatrous thing to
Mhm.
use the word worship in something other than God because
Yeah,
of all the
yeah.
baggage we have for it.
Yeah, I mean, there's ways to make the claim a little bit more subtle and interesting that there's a sort of deep religious impulse that we all try to, satisfy in various ways. And a lot of the ways that people try to satisfy that impulse outside of religion are inappropriate, unhelpful, blah, blah, blah. That's a more interesting claim and it's a much more subtle one. But I don't know. I guess the nature of this sort of YouTube-y thing, is this just on YouTube? This isn't like a TV show, is it? This is just a YouTube
As
thing?
far as I'm aware, it is just a YouTube
I'm
thing.
sure I'm sure they encourage the more sweeping, provocative
Mhm.
types of stuff. I don't know, but yeah, okay, yeah, that one is just I just don't think that one's terribly interesting,
Yeah,
I
and
guess.
again, it's one of those things where it's like going back to the whole like you're trying to kind of shake somebody loose from, they think that the idea of religion is so foreign to them. And so if you can get them to see some sort of like crossover or parallels, then you can maybe see like, oh, well, maybe if I'm already doing some of these religious things for, non-religious stuff, maybe it wouldn't be maybe it's trying to build a bridge a little bit, but again, that's just, I'm I'm just non-confrontational, and I want everybody to get along. So, but anyway, claim 4. So the last one: atheists accept Christian morality but deny the religion's foundational stories. Atheists accept Christian morality but deny the religion's foundational stories.
I mean, all right, so this one's tough. Um, I mean, if you're saying that atheists accept a full-throated, what I think is a traditional biblical Catholic morality, the answer is obviously not. I mean, look how
Mm,
most atheists think about sexual ethics, or I mean, there's points of commonality, of course, right?
mm,
But there's also huge disagreement on specific moral claims. So I think that one's no. There are some things, human dignity, for example,
mm,
is obviously deeply rooted in the Christian tradition, not necessarily exclusive to it. Um, and then you could just become more and more broad. So I think the more specific you are, like, okay, here's the Catholic Catechism. Do you accept everything that is that is
yeah,
more than no? Obviously not, right? Okay, well, do you just accept that there is an objective moral realm, which brings us back to a lot of what we talked about with the sciencey thing.
yeah,
Yeah, but that's logically independent from the Christian project. Of course, Christianity, I believe, is committed to and promotes a moral realism and has a system for it, has a framework for it for understanding it. But there's other systems, other frameworks aside from Christianity, like Platonism, that propose that. So I don't know. Those are the different ways you can go. In one sense, it's an obvious no. In the other sense, yeah, there's shared commitments, but it's hard to see that you can accuse them just because they're moral realists and share some, the same ethical commitments as Christians, that they're just like totally stealing from Christianity. Cut flower ethics, right? You take the and then you cut off the
yeah.
root and that sort of thing.
Well, you see this, I mean, so you see this sort of claim used with a lot of like conservative pundits of like, this society was built on Christian values, but now we're trying to cut off the Christian source, and of course society's going to crumble, right? So it's sort of like a smaller version of that claim where it's like,
Yeah.
or maybe it's a bigger version if you're talking Christian morality, but like when you want to talk about things, we can like a Christian and a non-Christian can agree on the idea of go back to teleology, right? Because so much of the natural law tradition is based off of teleology.
Mhm.
And so you can say, oh well, I don't have to be a Christian to accept teleology, right? Because we've got Aristotle, so it's like
Mhm.
it's already. But and then you can maybe extend that to say, oh well, certain areas of Christian sexual ethics has to do with teleology because of the purpose of the act itself, or the purpose of the relationship itself, blah blah blah. But when you start getting into, and maybe this is one of the things that would set Christian morality apart, where if you try to show this connection, you can maybe strengthen the claim a little bit, or it could become a little bit more of a bridge. You kind of talked about like inherent human dignity, or from a Christian standpoint, the what's called in Catholic social teaching the preferential option for the poor, where it's
Mhm.
like you can't, like, that's where you're not going to necessarily see that inherently in something like teleology, or even the fact that like we share the same DNA. Why does that automatically mean we have the same value as persons, right? There's not, that's going to be a bigger leap, right?
Yeah.
And so that's maybe something where
You need a
you,
lot more metaphysical equipment
yeah.
to try and get to a special human value and ontological status. I agree with that, and like undeniably, right? Like so much of our culture is influenced by its Christian and indeed Catholic roots, right?
Mm.
Um, but that man, that is a messy thing, right? To
It
get
is.
into
You can't prove it in 15 minutes of a YouTube video, right? Or a
Yeah,
movie.
no way,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
yes, of course, we grew out of that, totally. So there's a lot of that still in the mix, in the soup, right? And how much of it remains in the soup that is worth having for a lot of people? I think a lot, right? Yet how much of that is compatible with the deeper underlying philosophical, metaphysical, non-religious commitments of a lot of people? I think a lot, right? But that's a big
Well,
conversation, right? Yeah, and
and no, and it's definitely a point where, and obviously Peterson was not trying to, and he's never tried to be an analytical philosopher by any means, but this is definitely a good example of where it really goes beyond the purely analytical philosophical kind of realm, because especially in the claim itself where he says foundational stories, right? He doesn't say foundational claims or foundational propositions, he says foundational stories. And it reminds me of, I don't know how, are you familiar with maybe you've heard the name at least, but familiar with Rene Girard and, a lot of the stuff associated with him. So like, this is where, when we talk about things like, and I know that the whole like scapegoat mechanism and the kind of like raising up of the victim, and so much of Rene Girard's work is saying, hey, this didn't exist until, like Jesus, basically. Like, Jesus is the one who flipped this whole scapegoat thing on its head, and that's why we assume that now. We assume, the inherent dignity of the person, or the preferential option for the poor, or the the protection of the victim, or the protection of the those who can't stand up for themselves, all the sorts of things that most people in polite society would at least agree on the surface. And so much of that comes from, or at least according to Girard, is this idea of, the person you claim to be God became the victim. And that's a foundational story. It's obviously the foundational story of Christianity. And so, like, if you're going to build a morality from that, right, that's going to be very different from just recognizing, oh, well, in nature, we see inherent purpose or inherent telos in things, right? You can see how that's the little bit of the divergence, right?
So as always, I think it's important to be careful. There's a lot of historical and cultural details in this sort of claim, right, of which I am largely ignorant. I know lots of scholars that propose the sort of thing that Peterson is getting at. I know that there's lots who disagree with that. Now, don't get me wrong. I think I'm fully signed on to the traditional Christian ethic, right? I think it's right for a convergence of reasons. But I just don't like making arguments that I'm not confident in, right? Right. It's just because you make claims like this, and then from a position of considerable ignorance, and people might sign on to it, and then more details come to light, and they realize they were sold a false bill of goods, and like, what purpose have you really done there? What good have you really done? I think there's a number of ways to argue for the goodness and the truth of Christianity, right? Including the Christian ethical system, right? And I think it's beautiful. I think it's a demanding, absolutely demanding, right? But beautiful ethical system, and one which I've tested, right? I tested the liberal one for many years, right? I lived that life. So I've got a little bit of a comparison here. So I have a lot to say in favor of it, but do I want to make these sort of claims that, you're right, these are very, very popular claims, especially among like podcast hosts. I just don't think that they're being very, very careful. Or again, what you find is they would have to be so qualified and so walk back to the point that you probably lose a lot of what makes them interesting in the first place. Yeah.
Well, and it's almost like there's like a seed there that I think could grow into something more. It's maybe a little irresponsible to. It's not quite the stick you want to wield yet.
And not only that, but like, there's going to be lots of people too. They're going to be like, oh yeah, we were influenced by Christian morality and all that, how tough it is on sex and how good it is we got rid of that. Right. So like, you have to be attentive that, it's not just, like, there's still a lot of stuff that people hold on to. But there's also a lot of stuff that people don't. And they seem to like be glad, and they think that the more we get rid of, probably the better. So, there's going to be different attitudes on that. So even if you think this is just by default a useful, right? Forget like whether it's true, which I think is always a mistake, but just a useful sort of tactic. I think even that's a mistake.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess, we're coming up to about an hour, and that was all 4 of them. So I don't know if, and just if you had any overall kind of like I said, we weren't going to do this based off of vibes, but if there were any vibes afterwards, we could kind of give some of the, now that we've kind of picked apart, I think, the claims themselves.
Yeah. So I'm going to just call this video "The Claims of Jordan Peterson," because I didn't watch the whole thing, but those are the claims that are being made, and those are my initial thoughts on them. So there's obviously a whole lot of context that I'm probably missing, so people can feel free to share their own thoughts, and I hope they do. I think the format's cool. I like the idea of, getting people to argue. I don't know how productive it is.
Mhm.
Like when you're kind of forced to try to dive deep into subjects that take a lot of time to think through carefully, and you only have,
It
again, I
was
didn't
like
watch
it
it. I don't
was
like, how long do people have? They have
it
like
was
a
speed
minute, 2
dating
minutes.
philosophy,
It's like
yeah.
speed dating. Yeah, exactly. So
But that's the thing is
so
it
I would
makes
say
good
treat
for
that,
clips, right?
treat
It
that like a debate. Debates are, which it is a debate, right? It's sort of micro
mm,
debates, which is even worse in a sense. Debates, online debates, whatever. I always tell people, like, look, this isn't the end of the conversation. Let it be the start. Let it get you interested. Let it get you thinking about these things, and then realize that there's a whole world, a whole line of deep thought that you can then continue to explore. So as a way to get people into the conversations, I think they're great. But if people like take these as end all be alls, I think that would be not good right there.
yeah, well, and I think to kind of not to go back, I know we already kind of finished talking about claim 4, but I think that all 4 of the claims and the video in its entirety, it becomes useful in terms of, and I know we've kind of not quibbled, but like talked about the term worldview recognition versus worldview construction, right? Because in some ways we don't want to be the god of this world. We want to be the ones who are participating in it or receiving it, and or I should say this worldview. And going back to the accepting Christian morality but denying the foundational stories, right? That's worldview building, or that's worldview construction, or that's worldview recognition, is when you can see the good in this story, and you want to live it out. You want to participate it more than just passively enjoying it, but actually actively like playing a part in it, right? And it's not just, I'm gonna you mentioned before when you were talking about worship, like obviously worship means something very different to a Catholic when we're talking about the representation of the sacrifice, right? And it's our foundational story, right? The incarnation, Jesus on the cross, and our like participation in it. That's worldview, building, quote unquote, in our own kind of lives. And it's the same thing when it comes to having these discussions about God, or arguments about God, or debates about God, or whatever. So
Cool.
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's it, guys. All right, share your thoughts below. We'll catch you next time. If you like what you hear, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and be sure to check out the Substack. Lots going on over at the Journal of Absolute Truth. We'll drop a link below. Thanks, Mike.
Yep. See you, Pat. Thanks.